Hey everyone, Warwick's here. So patch 10.1.7 is well on the PTR now. We kind of know pretty much all the changes that are going to be coming down, barring maybe one or two last minute additions to the spec itself. But what I wanted to do today is kind of look forward not to 10.1.7 but to 10.2. So I've been seeing, actually inspired by Kalamazoo, so shout outs to Kalamazoo, who's doing a Warlock series, which if you're a Warlock fan, go check him out. Uh, it's the Warlock Daddy, as he's somewhat called. Anyways, he's doing a 10.2 wish list of just a couple of things he wants to see for every spec. He's doing it in all separate videos. I'm just going to do one video on what I'd like to see from both the class tree and then, of course, the specs and what kind of changes I'd like to see as a pseudo wish list for patch 10.2. Now, I'm going to start with Restoration Druid here because it's the spec that, admittedly, I know the least about. It's the spec that I understand the least about its current state, and then we'll kind of hit on the other specs as well moving forward. So we're going to start with the Restoration Druid, but first I want to hit up on the the Druid class tree. And my number one wish for the Druid class tree come patch 10.2 is more connections. Right now the tree is very much stunted by the lack of connections, particularly in the upper part of the tree. Now, I've made a thing like this before, but basically, here's what I want to see come for the tree in terms of its sort of future iterations with its thing. So, in terms of connections, what I'd like to see is Sunfire connect to Improve Nature's Cure. So what this does, this is allow Balanced Druid, or in this case, it'll be remove Corruption for the other specs. But what it does is it allows Balanced Druids to quickly access this without having to dip down into 3 points. So instead of spending 3 points to get towards this, they can only spend 1. And that way, if they want to go more like Frenzied Regen, Improve Bark Skin, Verdant Heart, to come down here and grab Thick Hide for that more like defensive aspect of their tree, they can, without having to drop 3 points into the resto side in order to grab this here. I'd then like to see Improve Nature's Cure connect to Nurturing Instinct. What this will do is this will actually allow Balance and Feral Druids to grab their remove Corruption, and then for Bear Druids in particular, it allows for that magical damage and healing increase, so we can help with something like Afflicted. So we'd grab something like Reju, Swift Mend, remove Corruption, and they can jump down into Nurturing Instinct. The third connections that I'd like to see made are Nurturing Instinct connect to Astral Influence and to Natural Recovery. Again, this opens up build diversity options for both, really all the specs, to where a Resto Druid could come over here and grab this, but then come over and grab the range, and then come down this way without having to drop 1, 2, 3, multiple points over here, so that they can open up build diversity to grab something like Forest Walk, or come down and grab Matted Fur for more defensive purposes, and grab Ursine Vigor for more defensive purposes. I think all of these would open up kind of the tree options and help make build diversity in the class tree across each spec feel more clean. Another change that I'd like to see more on the physical side of the tree is Thick Hide connects to Skull Bash. And maybe even Feline Swiftness connect to Skull Bash, and Killer Instinct connect to each of these talents as well. So what this does is for Feral Druids, they grab, Rake Rip, but then they can grab Thrash, Improve Swipe, Killer Instinct, and then just come down here to Thick Hide. They save this point in Iron Fur that they don't really need or use to grab Thick Hide. And then they can come down and grab Matted Fur and maybe grab something like an Ursine Vigor. Or come over here and grab like a Tireless Pursuit, or grab a Maim, which allows them to open up their utility a little bit. Or if they come over onto this side with some of the suggested changes, they can grab something like a Typhoon or a Hibernate. So you're sacrificing a defensive option to pick up more utility. Right now they can't. If they want to get Thick Hide for that damage reduction, they have to come through and get Iron Fur, which feels bad. So, in general, I just want to see more connections. You could even argue something like Rising Light, Falling Night connects to Improve Rejuve. I don't think that's totally necessary, but you could make that argument. You could also make the argument that Skull Bash connects straight up to where Incap Roar and Mighty Bash go. And that way you can choose to bypass Primal Fury or Matted Fur in order to come grab your single or AoE CC, and then drop down into things like Protector of the Pack. All right, so that's kind of the main wish that I have for the Druid class tree. Other wishes that I think are less likely is I'd like to see these two talents split. I think it feels bad not to have both. It has always felt bad not to have both. So being able to take these, make them baseline, and then specialize in how you want each of these to work. Like you could take it to where Mighty Bash also slows a target, or Incap Roar slows after the Incap is over. Mighty Bash allows for like damage reduction, for like 3 seconds against you directly. Obviously very good for Bear. The slow would be good for Bear, good for all the other specs to help out. Like make these two baseline and then just allow for this choice node to decide which one you want to improve. That's another thing I'd like. Druids kind of have to be very choosy about their CC options. As you can see in this resto build that I am with, this is a more Mythic Plus base build. I'm getting Hibernate, but then I'd have to sacrifice points somewhere, probably in Nature's Vigil. I haven't updated these builds to grab like Typhoon, which could be potentially useful on like Spiteful weeks. Hibernate obviously useful for Incorporeal and just generally speaking but you can't get Cyclone. I can't come over here and get Incap and Mighty Bash because of the lack of connections in the tree. So like there's just a bunch of different things that you could do to kind of help make Druid CC feel a lot more like you have true choice in the matter, not that you basically are forcing a skip onto things like Restos can't get this without going some wonky build paths, or maybe it's changed. I haven't updated these builds in a while. The final thing that I'd like to see do is our capstones get either reworked or looked at. Now, Nature's Vigil took a significant nerf because it went from 40%. Went from like 40% of healing done to 30 seconds to basically getting cut in half, to where this talent point probably shouldn't even be taken anymore. Heart of the Wild needs to be kind of looked at. It's very niche use, although with the new talent coming for Resto Druids in Master Shapeshifter in 1.7, this talent may find itself in, but at 5 minutes on a cooldown, it just feels really prohibitive. And Protector of the Pack just feels like it isn't capstone worthy. It's good. There are certain Bear Druid builds where you could consider it. Feral Druids definitely take it, but Balance and Resto Druids have no reason to ever want this. And so just finding a way to make it feel like it should be something you want to come chase is, I think, going to be like one of the most useful things. Just the mic here, sorry. All right, so that's the class tree. So I think the biggest one is definitely give those connections, particularly right up in here, that just open up the tree a little bit more and allow for more fun build diversity to come through. Because right now, every Druid class tree is very cookie cutter stagnant. Like you basically are picking the same thing every single time. The only flex points is do you take Hibernate, Typhoon, maybe sometimes Incessant Tempest. But that's about it. Like all Druid class trees are basically the same. All Moon King class trees, the same. Resto class trees, the same. Like there's no options for creative build diversity to allow your Druid to feel like it can be spec'd into other things. All right, so let's move on to Resto Druid. So Resto Druid, like I said, admittedly the spec that I know the least about, but there are some things that I want to take a look at. Let me grab this. Now, from a pure sort of healing throughput perspective, I actually think Resto Druid in raid settings is actually pretty good, and the data kind of shows that out. From an HPS percent at the 95th percentile in Mythic, they're right up there with Holy Paladin and Mistweaver Monk as being kind of really high throughput healers. From a damage perspective, it is very different. As you can tell, they are one of the all bosses healers. As you can see, they are the worst right there with Preservation of Ochre and Holy Priest, which is kind of what you expect for healing. So they don't have a good way to, like, you're really being forced into choose one or the other, which I actually think is probably okay. But right now, like, is the healing that they're doing compensating for the lack of damage? In Rays, I think fine. In Mythic Plus, I don't think it is. So a talent like Master Shapeshifter, which was announced, let me see if I can grab the details on Master Shapeshifter. But basically, what it's going to do is, let me grab the Wowhead link. So right now, Master Shapeshifter is kind of like a PvP talent, but it is getting a change in 10.1.7, which is basically, here it is, PTR development notes. Let me move this over for you here. So as you can see, new talent, basically your abilities are amplified based on your current shapeshift form, and it only hits the other three shapeshiftings. So you get more defensiveness. So you get 30% additional armor when you slap an Iron Fur, and you generate about 2,500 extra mana. So it helps with mana regen. Rip, Ferocious Bite, and Maim deal more damage and generate 10,000 mana when cast with 5 combo points. So it sounds like it's about 2,000 mana per combo point. And then Wrath, Starfire, and Star Surge deal more damage and generate 2,500 mana. So I think this is going to be an interesting talent potentially to allow for that more weaving, like kitty weaving, owl weaving type playstyle that I know a lot of Resto Druids love from their times in BFA and even at some points in Shadowlands. And then you have new talents in like Grove Guardians, Wild Synthesis is being updated. Embrace of the Dream is getting set up. Deep Focused and Forced Flow are both being removed. So let's find those. So Forced Flow right here getting removed. Trying to see where Deep Focus is at. Somewhere in this tree, I know. But basically, like, they're making some tweaks to the spec itself so that it can overall see some tweaks to it. And the Grove Guardians basically allows you to will immediately cast Swiftman on your current target. They will also cast Nourish on that target or a nearby ally periodically. Now, Nourish is a spell that has been getting a lot of attention from Blizzard recently. Basically, it heals a friendly target and then gets extra bonus from Mastery. As you can see, it's 9,000 mana, 1.5 second cast. It's kind of prohibitive in a way, considering right now I have 250k mana. It's not bad, but it doesn't really do anything that regrowth and the hot base stuff already does, which is kind of the problem with it. So what are my big wish list things for Druid? One, kind of make their kit in 5-bans feel a little bit better. The kit does really well, I think, in a raid situation, but in 5-bans with a lot of the burst damage and the yo-yoing of damage, Resto Druid as the most proactive healer outside of maybe Disc Priest. You have to be very, very smart with how you prep, and generally speaking, it's very hard to make that happen. The other thing that I'd like to see, just as a general rule of thumb, is I'd like to see some of this point, like this tree feels really bloated, especially here at the bottom. And I'd like to see them see if there's any ways to combine effects. So for example, this is what I'm thinking about, like maybe the Adaptive Swarm and Unbridled Swarm just become, like, that's just the way Adaptive Swarm works. Or you look at like Verdant Infusion, just making that part of Swiftman's thing. Or looking at something like Improved Wild Growth, just make that part of what Wild Growth does. There's a ton of talents, it feels like, in this tree, and I'd like to see them find a way to reduce the talents itself and but without losing some of the effects, which helps potentially open up some build diversity and make some of these like more like niche talents, something like Luxuriant Soil or Germination, which are used in raid builds, but not so much in Mythic Plus builds. But like in a Mythic Plus build, like why would I use Invigorate? There's no reason to. There's no way to get the point out of here. And then you have like Deep Focus, which is the other one that got removed here. Circle of Life and Death. Like, is there a way to incorporate these into a different talent? Can it go into something like Verdancy? Can it go into something like Undergrowth slash Power of the Archdruid? Is there a way to combine some of these effects? And then really look at talents that are not taken at all. Like Waking Dream, I rarely see anyone use. Tranquil Mind, rarely see anyone use. Is there a way to make these kind of baked into Flash of Clarity and things like that? Things with like Stone Bark, Improved Iron Bark, can you make that work? Regenerative Heartwood, can you make that just baseline into Iron Bark? Is there ways to kind of reduce the talent bloat so that the tree feels like it has more effective qualities for you? Like I said, I'm not the smartest Resto Druid in the world. I generally know how the kit works on a very basic level. I'm not the most effective player of it. Resto Druid, not my favorite healer. I do enjoy it, but it's not my favorite healer. Mistweaver Monk does hit that qualification for me. But I think there's just something that could be done with this tree to kind of make it feel less bloated. I mean, because like you look at the like raid builds. I mean, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 talents that get changed. In some ways, that's a good thing, but at the same time, that's like it feels like it's a bit much. And I don't know if that's overall healthy for the spec in its long-term prospects. So that would be the most biggest change I'd like to see for Resto Druid. Is find a way to make the kit feel more effective in 5-mans with a lot of like bursty damage, and give Resto Druids a better way to react to it. Whether it's like a talent that allows you to swift mend multiple targets, or allow for something that allows for that like snap reactive, oh shit, I need to get things like hit a button. Because like on Mistweaver, for example, I can hit, Revival is a big cooldown, but if someone gets into a thing like I've got my Renewing Mist spread and things like that, but then someone takes this huge chunk of damage, I have an instant Vivify. I can Phalanx Stomp and get the Ancient Teachings debuff or buff, and then just Rising Sun Kick and get some good healing out of that, or Blackout Kick and get some good healing out of that. Resto Druid doesn't have anything that allows them to snap someone back up or multiple people back up very quickly. And I think I'd like to see that change in the kit. All right, let's move on to Balanced Druid, which is, right now my favorite DPS of the Balanced Druid specs, mainly because their tier set is an absolute garbage like Feral is. But Balance, I think, is in an interesting position because, again, it comes down to, I think, one major thing that we want to see for Balanced Druids in patch 10.2, and that is some tweaks to their talents so that there is build diversity again. So in patch 10.0, there was like this massive heavy dot playstyle with like Stellar Flare, Stellar Innervation kind of being part of that before Astral Smolder kind of got buffed, reworked. Like Nature's Balance was there. You would just spend, and like you basically were spending most of your time focusing on dots and like Starfall Eclipses, or Star Surge and single target, and you basically didn't care about the Eclipse mechanic. Blizzard really didn't enjoy that playstyle long term and had a massive ramp up time. So this spec was really bad in like low keys or even in like short, quick fights and raids. And it was a really awful target switcher. So like if you had to switch a target, like on the Amalgamation Chamber, for example, where you have Shadow and Fire, if you have to target switch for any reason, your Balanced Druid ignored that call and just stayed where they were at because it was such a massive damage loss for them to get their 3 dots back on that target and begin their ramp again. Well, Blizzard kind of swung it to the complete opposite way. Now, admittedly, I will say this is my playstyle preference for Moonkin Druid, which focuses a lot more on Wrath and Starfire and uses the dots more as maintenance tools to enable other things. So it enables things like Shooting Stars. It enables things like where'd it go? Waning Twilight. It enables things like Cosmic Rapidity. It does enable, of course, through your mastery, your spells do more when those are on the target. This is my preferred style of play, so I know I'm biased from this, but I also understand that there are many Moonkin Druids that hate this playstyle. They liked the mobility of the dot-based playstyle. So finding a way to kind of fine-tune it to where that build may be like a viable playstyle in really high keys or in raid, while still allowing for this more nuke-based playstyle with Wild Surge's Astral Smolder and Soul of the Forest, to kind of find its way in. It's a very, very tough balancing act. I think it makes it so that it's quite difficult to make it work effectively because there's always just going to be one build that swings wildly to the other. But the result is that, like, single target to Mythic Plus, literally one talent changes over here. And I'm not even convinced you need to change this one. And that is Star Weaver into Rattle the Stars. Like, I'm not even convinced that you need that. Which kind of leads me to my second one, is that there needs to be maybe some shuffling of talents. I think the tree shape and the connections that it has is pretty good. But something like Power of Goldrin, when you're not using Star Surge all that often outside of boss fights in Mythic Plus, being required in order for you to grab things like Star Lord, Wrath of Elune, Radiant Moonlight. If you go the New Moon route, you can. Or even something like Star Weaver, Rattle the Stars, just kind of feels bad. Because you're essentially wasting 2 points in a talent that you're only going to use quite literally on 4 fights. Or 3 fights or 5 fights. However many bosses are in the dungeon. Whereas, like, sticking it, kind of over, like, in this area where, like, maybe Umbral Intensity is at, or switching it with, like, Nature's Grace, where it kind of becomes an optional talent that you can shift around as you'd like, or stick it here with under, like Umbral Embrace, something along those lines. Just something that makes it so that it doesn't feel as mandatory as it does when literally all it does is proc off a Star Surge. Now, you could maybe tweak it to where it does proc off a Starfall, but does so at a very reduced rate. Where maybe the PPM when you're using Starfall is much lower than when you're using Star Surge. You could see that, and I think that would be a potential interesting one. Or you make something like Astral Communion, which no one has ever taken in their life, make it so that Power of Goldrin can, when the Spirit of Goldrin hits, it like splashes damage. But then you'd have to make Power of Goldrin predictable and when you could use it. So, like, there's some interesting changes that could happen there. Other than that, I think this tree is done pretty well. I'd like to see mushrooms get some sort of tweak or buff, because in a Mythic Plus build, like, it feels like mushrooms should just be there. I think mushrooms are a great talent. I enjoyed them when they were first introduced back, I think, in Cataclysm. When I was messing around with them in the Cataclysm beta back then, I loved them. Maybe the Astral Power generation could be tweaked a little bit to be a little bit lower, so in exchange you get more damage. But, like, I think that something that allows mushrooms into fungal growth being useful in a Mythic Plus build, I think, is really useful. So those are my 2 changes. Do something to make build diversity happen. Do something with wild mushrooms, and do something with Spirit of Goldrin or Power of Goldrin. Other than that, I actually really enjoy Balanced Druid in its current form. I think it plays really well. It feels really good. It's good in both Raid, good in Mythic Plus. And the gameplay loop feels a lot better. Eclipse being valuable and mattering again is really nice. I just think that any setup where you basically ignore Eclipse is never good for the spec's health. And right now you do care about which Eclipse you're in. Now there's some degenerate stuff that you can do, but it's like maybe a 0.5% increase that only the pure min maxers are going to do. But for the most part, I think this spec is in a pretty decent place. It just needs some small polishing on the outskirts, and maybe some look into where certain talents are placed or how certain talents function. All right, let's move on to Feral Druid. Now, Feral Druid, I think, is one of the more interesting specs right now because it has incredibly strong AoE tools and incredibly weak single target tools. Now, that has changed a little bit with some of the things that you can grab. Something like Dire Fixation is going to be really nice in a single target situation, and has been good in a single target situation. So you go from there. But again, this build, this tree again suffers from things that feel like they're not really making sense with each other, is the best way that I can put it. Of course, you still have the controversy with Blood Talents, Lion Strength. That's always going to be there. You have Vein Ripper, Rip and Tear. That's always interesting. Brutal Slash being used over Wild Slashes. I think the tree, for the most part, is mostly okay. The thing that I want to see happen with Feral is they really need to rethink how the spec is going to function, in, or how they want the specs to play in single target and AoE. Because right now they basically play extremely different in ways that are both good and bad. So in AoE, of course, you're focusing a lot on Primal Wrath with Tear Open Wounds, potentially Double Clawed Rake. I can see that. But then you have something like Taste for Blood, which is both yes and no. It kind of depends. Or you look at like something like Relentless Predator, just feels like it shouldn't be in this build. Cat's Curiosity just really shouldn't be in this build. Does something like Lunar Inspiration, Adaptive Swarm belong in with Feral anymore? I know there's always been this laser cat fantasy that a lot of people cling to because it has been played in the past and has been pretty good in the past. But with everything that Feral manages already, between trying to maintain its snapshotting, trying to maintain its bleeds at its highest snapshotted count, adding something like Lunar Inspiration and Adaptive Swarm on top of that just feels like it's complexity for the sake of complexity and not complexity for the sake of meaningful gameplay. So I'd like to see maybe them purge some of these talents out and bring back some old favorites that people have. And then you have certain defensive talents that just feel like they are never going to be taken because there's so many important damage talents in here. So again, like with Restoration Druid, can you combine some of these effects? Can you combine something like Taste for Blood with Rampant Ferocity? Is that something that we could look into? And then all of a sudden, you get an extra talent point to kind of play around with here, and some single target builds or even AoE builds. Can you change Taste for Blood so that it's periodic effects? Then all of a sudden, you could do a very heavy periodic effect build with Lunar Inspiration, Adaptive Swarm, Thrash, Rip, Rake, and even potentially something like Rip and Tear, where all of a sudden you get this really tight window where if you hit a max Ferocious Bite, it can chunk really, really heavily, but it takes a lot of setup to get there, so it rewards smart play. But, can you combine something like Rampant Ferocity and Taste for Blood? Can you look at something like Predatory Swiftness and just make it baseline? Like, this is the only defensive talent that you take outside of Survival Instincts, and go from there. Can you look at doing something like with Infected Wounds and putting it into like, Merciless Claws or Thrashing Claws, so that you can open it up. Feral feels pretty squishy in raid settings right now, so having something like Protective Growth would be nice, but there's just no way to get to it because there's so many key crucial damage talents. So what's the overall outlook for Feral? I think they should look into seeing what effects they can combine in the talents to kind of clean up the talent tree. And they need to do something about the fact that it feels like there are certain playstyles that are here just for the sake of being here and are not here for the sake of actually wanting any sort of meaningful development or aspects to it. So clean up the playstyle of Feral a little bit. Always look into its borrowed power situation. Like, its tier bonus is just so bad. And then look for really good and unique ways to kind of keep it balanced and tuned. I actually think Feral is still incredibly fun to play. It is still one of my favorite melee DPS specs out there right now. It's just I've been enjoying Moonkin a lot this tier. And I kind of fell behind on this character because I started out the tier playing Warrior DK. Now I'm back on my Druid as my main, so I'm trying to develop these gear sets for this character. And so still have work to do on that regard. But I think they need to kind of clean up some potential play styles. Things like Lunar Inspiration, Adaptive Swarm, some lesser extent Feral Frenzy, and like Relentless Predator. These feel like trap talents. They feel like they're here purposely to trap players that don't understand the complexity behind the builds. Cat's Curiosity kind of at the same way. Like, it's an energy regen talent that doesn't really have a place because we don't use things. Obviously that have to check all the updated builds, but like Tireless Energy, it's rare that you use both points in it. Now the Dire Fixation's in the build for single target. Like, we don't take Ashamane's Guidance, but we run Incarn for the most part still. I think it's still the better of the two talents. Like, and this is something else, just like Incarn versus Convoke like just needs to be investigated for all the specs. Like Druid, like Resto Druid likes Convoke, doesn't really like their own Incarn because of the value that you gain out of it, but the rest of the specs just don't give a shit about Convoke. Like, do something about that too. All right, and finally Bear Druid, which is the spec that is inarguably to me the best in terms of its health, of what the spec is right now in terms of what it can do. And so I don't actually have a ton to say about this particular spec itself. Now, there are things in the class tree that I would love to be able to get. I would love to be able to not have to like sacrifice potentially my extra range in order to get something like remove corruption for Mythic Plus affix purposes. I'd love to see maybe an extra talent point or two here allows me to grab something like hibernate or make cyclone useful in a lot of PvE situations. But from the class tree side, we've already talked about that. From the spec tree side, there are still things that I'd like to see changed or improved, but the wish list on this is much more minor because Guardian Druid is obviously in a very good place right now. Ursox Fury did take a small nerf from 60 to 50%. I think that's one of the two things that's making it an outlier. Admittedly, they probably need to look at something like After the Wildfire because it does like massive. It's like the scaling on it is ridiculous. So it probably needs to be adjusted from like 600% of attack power to like 500% of attack power. And I think that makes Druid still really good, but not necessarily a full-on outlier. Now, like I said, there are still problems with this tree that I'd like to see addressed. Scintillating Moonlight at 2 points for 5-10% damage reduction just feels really poor. If you look at like a raid laser build, like you're not even taking it just because it doesn't do anything. And so it's kind of a talent that's dead right now. Lunar Beam is interesting in theory, but I think in practice it's still very limited by the fact that you plant in one place and go. So I'd like to see that. Maybe Flashing Claws, maybe there. I'd still like to see Blood Frenzy made much more accessible in the tree itself. And then there are just some talents in the middle of the tree that I think just need to be evaluated. I've been very much on the record about Vulnerable Flesh. If you watched any of my Guardian Druid videos, you know how much I hate this talent, especially where it's at, especially it being the only way to get to Tooth and Claw. Like, I think it's just kind of horrible design to make a talent that is so boring and so fundamentally not interesting and so fundamentally just not even all that great block off what, in my opinion, is one of the best talents in this tree. Tooth and Claw is a fantastic idea, and now that it allows for now that it makes Maul useful, makes Raise very useful, like, man, I love this talent, and I'm so glad we can use it because in the old trees you couldn't. Here now it's really good. It's in a really nice place with the exception of the fact that it's gated by this talent. Even something simple like making Vicious Cycle and Tooth and Claw connect to each other, I think would be a huge, huge quality of life change. And then in builds that do take Vicious Cycle where Vulnerable Flesh could be, you could get more interesting with something like Reinvigoration. Or come down and grab like Pulverize. Or take a Moonfire talent or two to kind of allow for that type of gameplay cycle. Because like, for example, in the Dream of Scenarios build, we take it. Now, just imagine if this were here at 2 points, Vicious Cycle here at 2 points. Even that's fine. Even at 2 points, I'm okay with that. Make it like, 7 and 15 or whatever. Vulnerable Flesh is here. Now, I'm getting rid of Vulnerable Flesh just because the chance to crit strike is like, it's not super relevant. It's a little bit of a DPS gain, but the DPS gain that you get overall is not there. Now, all of a sudden, I could see about maybe grabbing an Elun's Favorite to give me to make my Moonfire that I used to pull a little bit better. Potentially even opening it up to getting like Moonless Night, which is going to allow for things like Raise, Gore, and Maul in particular to do even more. So where I lose 30% chance on Raise and Maul, but I'm gaining 20% additional arcane damage on top of the Moonfire. because I'm grabbing both Elun's Favored and Moonless Nights. Like, I think it allows for that potential interesting build possibilities where you could sacrifice, like, 2 points. Do I sacrifice for, again, under the assumption that Vicious Cycle is here at 2 points? You take a point out of Vicious Cycle. Maybe you take a point out of Blood Frenzy. Maybe you take a point out of After the Wildfire. Like, there's definitely options in play here that allow you to potentially grab something like Elun's Favorite into Moonless Night that make this as a very interesting choice. Again, here, this is a spec that literally does not care about Convoke. Bear Druid hated Convoke in Shadowlands when it was even the best one for Bear, just because the stuff that goes in Bear is, like, just kind of awful. So, Bear Druid, I don't think needs tons of changes. There's some small things I'd still like to potentially see that could make and it's mostly just a quality of life aspect. But overall, like, I think that this spec is in the best health going into 10.2. And other than some small changes, and some small tuning changes, I don't think Bear needs a lot in terms of its tree outside of a few small quality of life adjustments that maybe allow for some more interesting build diversity. But then at the same time, you have to be careful about it, because that also means that you could see yourself just being able to get everything all the time, and your bear becomes even more powerful because of that. So anyways, guys, I appreciate you sticking around. If you stuck around for this long at 30, almost 37 minutes to kind of talk about the Druid 10.2 wish list, and kind of just some small things that I'd like to see, just kind of off the cuff, off the top of my head, that I could think of as we go through. I may go back and do follow-up videos as we get closer, particularly as we get closer to 10.1.7's release date. We start looking forward even more to 10.2. We take a look at some of the things that we could see for this class, and I may do individual videos on each spec so that we can really dive in. I'll have to do some research and some learning, more learning on Resto, but I'm feel pretty comfortable in my assessment of the other three specs because I am such huge fans of them. Bear is my favorite tank. Feral is one of, if not in my top 3 for melee. And Balance is my favorite caster right now, and it's not close. So I love those 3 specs. Resto, I'd say probably my second favorite healer behind Mistweaver, but admittedly healing is the role that I'm the least comfortable in, and the one that I'm trying to learn the more about. So anyways, guys, tangents aside, whatever. If you loved what this video did, or even if you enjoyed yourself, just like, share, and subscribe. Comment below on anything else that you would like to see on your 10.2 wish list for your favorite Druid spec. Until the next video, I hope you all stay safe. I hope you're enjoying yourself, you're having fun, you keep on gaming, and I will see you all in the next video.